In 1996, the disappearance of an entire family from the edges of a rural town began like a whisper, a story passed in cautious tones over fences and through diner booths, but it would soon grow into the kind of mystery that weighed heavy on the people who lived nearby. The family, a husband and wife with 3 young children, had chosen a life away from the rest of the world. They had built their cabin by hand on a plot of land tucked deep into the woods, far from paved roads and electrical lines. People who saw them in town described them as polite but reserved. They bought supplies sparingly, often flour, salt, and other basics they couldn't grow or hunt themselves. The children were shy, clinging to their mother when strangers spoke, and the father rarely lingered in conversation longer than necessary. They were not unfriendly, just private, the kind of people who seemed to belong to another time. Their way of life made them the subject of gossip even before their disappearance. Some admired their independence, saying it took grit to live without running water or electricity. Others thought there was something peculiar about deliberately cutting yourself off from the world. But no one could deny that the family seemed content with their choice. Their garden thrived in the spring and summer, rows of vegetables standing proudly against the wild backdrop of the forest. Chickens and goats could be heard from a distance, their sounds carrying faintly when the wind was right. In the evenings, smoke from the cabin's chimney often curled into the sky, a sign that life inside was steady and warm. Then, without warning, those signs of life stopped. The first person to notice was a neighboring farmer who relied on the father for occasional trade. He came by one late afternoon expecting to barter eggs for milk but found the cabin unusually quiet. No children's voices carried from the yard, no animals were penned where they usually were. The garden looked as if it hadn't been tended in days. He knocked on the door, but no one answered. He assumed, at first, that the family had gone deeper into the forest to hunt or gather wood. Yet when days turned into weeks, worry began to settle in. The sheriff's office was called, and soon a search party was organized. Men with lanterns and dogs scoured the trails leading in and out of the woods. They expected to find some trace, a discarded tool, a campsite, even a footprint, but the forest swallowed its secrets well. The cabin itself showed no signs of forced entry. The family's belongings remained inside, clothing neatly folded in a chest, children's toys scattered on the floor, dishes stacked in the sink as if waiting to be washed. It was as though they had stepped outside and never returned. The livestock told a different story. Chickens had wandered free and been picked off by foxes or vanished into the trees. The goats, once tethered, had broken loose and roamed wild. The dog, a loyal creature that neighbors remembered trailing after the children in town, was gone as well. Some speculated it had starved and perished, others that it had followed its masters into the woods. The silence around the cabin felt unnatural, unsettling enough that even the most determined searchers admitted the place gave them chills after sundown. With no evidence of struggle and no bodies, theories bloomed like weeds. Some believed the family had simply packed up and left, abandoning their homestead for reasons known only to them. Others were sure foul play was involved, whispering about drifters, hunters, or even local men who might have envied the family's independence. There were darker theories too, rumors that the father had grown unstable from isolation and done something unthinkable before disappearing himself. But without proof, the sheriff could do little more than file reports and mark the case unresolved. As months stretched into years, the disappearance faded into the background noise of town life, though it was never truly forgotten. Older residents would glance at the forest line with unease, while children dared each other to run as close as they could to the cabin's overgrown path. Parents used the story as a cautionary tale: don't wander too far, or you might end up like them. The cabin, though still standing, began to blend into the forest, slowly being reclaimed by vines and moss. It became a shadow, a place people avoided without quite knowing why, and the mystery of the vanished family turned into local folklore. A decade had passed since the family's disappearance, and by 2006 the cabin that once represented their self-sufficiency had become little more than a ghost in the woods. Few people went near it anymore. Hunters, trappers, and curious teenagers might wander close, but most turned back before setting foot inside. There was a superstition about the place, a sense that it carried bad luck or a kind of heavy silence that pressed on anyone who lingered too long. The forest had begun to reclaim it. Ivy climbed the walls, thick roots spread under the foundation, and the once tidy garden was nothing but tangled weeds and brambles. The fence posts leaned at odd angles, some collapsed entirely, their wood rotting in the damp earth. The cabin's roof sagged in the middle, shingles sliding away like loose teeth, leaving holes where rain poured in. From a distance, it looked like part of the woods, just another patch of shadow. It was on an autumn afternoon that two hunters stumbled across it again. The men had been tracking deer for most of the morning, moving deeper into the forest than they usually dared. The sun hung low, its light breaking in thin shafts through the canopy, and the air was sharp with the bite of the coming winter. As they pushed through the brush, one of them noticed the outline of the cabin ahead. He stopped, nudging his companion and pointing with a gloved hand. They knew instantly what it was. The story of the missing family was still told around town, and both men had grown up hearing it. Curiosity got the better of them. Despite the warnings, despite the unease, they decided to go closer. The air seemed to grow heavier as they approached. Fallen leaves crunched underfoot, and a crow cawed from somewhere above, startling them with its harsh cry. The closer they came, the stronger the odor became. At first it was faint, like damp wood and mold, but then it shifted into something far worse. A putrid stench clung to the air, the kind that caught in the back of the throat and made breathing uneasy. One of the men gagged and muttered that maybe they should turn back, but the other pressed forward, saying they had to see for themselves. The cabin's front door hung crooked on its hinges, the wood swollen from years of weather. Pushing it open sent a screeching groan through the silence, like the house itself resented being disturbed. Dust motes swirled in the dim light, stirred by the movement. Inside, the air was thick, stale, and layered with that same foul odor, stronger now, almost unbearable. The hunters pulled their collars over their noses and stepped inside cautiously. It was as if the family had vanished mid-routine. The wooden table still held dishes, some stacked, others with traces of dried food clinging to them. A child's tin cup lay on its side, its rim chipped. The shelves along the wall were stocked with jars of preserves, their contents dark and cloudy, the glass slick with dust and spiderwebs. In the corner lay a scatter of children's toys, blocks, a stuffed animal missing one button. And a hand-carved wooden horse. It was eerie, almost as though life had been interrupted in the middle of an ordinary day and frozen in place. The hunters' boots creaked on the floorboards as they moved further inside. Family photographs still clung to the walls, their frames askew. Faces smiled from behind the glass, frozen in happier times, the children's eyes bright and the parents' expressions calm. But the longer the hunters stood in the room, the more the sense of unease grew. Every creak of the wood, every whisper of wind through the cracks in the walls, made it feel as though the cabin was breathing around them, waiting for something to happen. Then came the flies. At first just a faint buzzing, it grew louder the longer they listened. One of the men followed the sound toward a collapsed section of the floor in the corner. The boards there were warped and broken, leaving a dark gap into what looked like a cellar or crawlspace beneath. The stench emanated from that direction, overpowering now. Swarms of fat black flies circled near the hole, landing on the broken wood and vanishing into the darkness below. The hunters exchanged an uneasy glance. Neither wanted to admit what they were thinking, but both knew. Whatever had happened to the family, the answer was waiting in the shadows beneath their feet. Their nerves broke. They stumbled back out into the cold air, gasping, the taste of rot still clinging to their throats. Neither man spoke as they hurried away from the cabin, but when they reached the road, they agreed they couldn't keep what they had seen to themselves. Something was in that cabin, something that didn't belong, and it wasn't just broken furniture and dusty photographs. The police had to be called. That night, as the hunters relayed what they'd found to the sheriff, the old story of the vanished family returned to life. The cabin was no longer just a rumor in the woods. It was a crime scene waiting to be uncovered, and the truth, long buried under dust, rot, and silence, was about to surface. When the sheriff's office received the hunters' report, there was no hesitation. By the next morning, investigators and deputies were making their way down the same overgrown path, armed not with rifles but with evidence bags, cameras, and heavy flashlights. The cabin had always been a place of speculation, but now, with the smell described in the hunters' account and the mention of flies swarming beneath the floorboards, the suspicion that it held more than just dust and decay could no longer be ignored. The team arrived just after sunrise, when fog still clung low to the ground, curling around the roots of the trees and giving the woods a hushed, almost reverent air. As they approached the cabin, the same stench the hunters had complained of rolled out to meet them. It was sour and unmistakable, the smell of rot that no amount of time could entirely erase. The deputies covered their noses with sleeves, while the lead investigator pushed the door open cautiously. Inside, nothing had changed since the hunters' visit. Dust clung to every surface, cobwebs spanned the corners, and the family's possessions sat frozen in time. A child's toy horse leaned against the hearth, its edges worn smooth by small hands that would never return to claim it. The eerie stillness was heavy, as though the air itself carried the weight of absence. It didn't take long for the investigators to focus on the collapsed section of floor in the far corner. The boards there were soft with rot, warped into unnatural shapes. The buzzing of flies grew louder as they neared, an angry, insistent hum that seemed to vibrate in the air. One of the deputies set down his flashlight and pried up the broken planks with a crowbar. The wood groaned in protest, splintering as it gave way, and the smell that burst upward from the crawlspace was overwhelming. Several men gagged, one stepping quickly outside to vomit in the grass. Those who stayed pressed handkerchiefs to their faces and braced themselves for what they were about to see. The beam of a flashlight cut into the darkness beneath the cabin, illuminating a sight that sent a chill through everyone present. Bones. At first just one, pale and jagged, but then more, the outline of a ribcage, the curve of a skull, the long, thin shape of arm bones tangled together. They were not neatly placed but scattered, piled haphazardly as if shoved into the space. Bits of clothing still clung to some of the remains, faded fabric eaten away by insects and time. Among them, swarms of maggots writhed, their pale bodies twisting in the beam of light, feasting on what little decomposition still lingered after so many years. The silence that followed the discovery was deafening. No one spoke. The only sounds were the relentless buzzing of the flies and the muted scuffle of boots on the cabin floor. Slowly, carefully, the forensic team began their work. Photographs were taken from every angle, capturing the grim tableau. One by one, the bones were lifted, placed into bags, and marked for later analysis. It soon became clear these were not the remains of a single individual. The skulls told the story first, one larger, broad, belonging to an adult, another slightly smaller, also adult, and then the smaller, fragile skulls of children. Each discovery deepened the horror. In the corner of the cellar, partially hidden by debris, investigators found something more chilling than bones alone. The faint outline of handprints marked the dirt wall, smeared and claw-like, as though someone had tried to dig their way out. The scratches trailed downward until they vanished into the soil, frozen testimony of desperation that had gone unanswered. The image unsettled even the most seasoned officers. It suggested not just death, but suffering, the final moments of people trapped in fear. As the remains were brought out into the open air, the cabin seemed to shift in presence. What had once been a house now felt like a tomb. The family that had vanished without explanation a decade ago had never left. Their story had not ended in mystery but in violence, sealed beneath the floor of their own home. The discovery spread quickly through the town, carried by whispers at the diner, murmurs at church gatherings, and conversations held in lowered voices at the grocery store. People who had once speculated about the family running off in the night or joining some hidden commune now confronted the truth. They had died there, together, hidden beneath the cabin where life had once seemed so steady. For investigators, the task was only beginning. It was not enough to find the bodies, they had to determine how they had died, who had placed them there, and why. But for those who stood in that cabin on that morning in 2006, the image of maggots writhing over the bones of an entire family would remain seared into their memories forever. The truth had finally begun to surface, pulled into the light by insects and decay, and with it came the weight of questions that demanded answers. The forensic analysis began almost immediately after the remains were pulled from beneath the cabin. The bones, bagged and carefully labeled, were sent to a state lab where specialists would spend weeks reconstructing the grim puzzle. But even on site, investigators began piecing together a narrative. They had multiple victims, 2 adults and 3 children, their skeletons bearing the unmistakable marks of trauma. Under the fluorescent lights of the examination room, cracks and indentations told a story of violence that time could not erase. Skulls showed evidence of blunt force impact, sharp fractures that radiated outward like shattered glass. Several ribs bore hairline breaks, consistent with defensive wounds. Forensic anthropologists determined the injuries had occurred around the time of death, ruling out any theory that the family had simply succumbed to starvation or illness in isolation. This had been brutal, deliberate. The sheriff, a man who had carried the unsolved case in his files for a decade, sat in silence as the initial findings were read aloud. His expression was heavy, as though vindication and horror had arrived hand in hand. The town had always speculated about what had happened, but speculation was easier than fact. The fact was far worse than anyone had dared say aloud. Someone had killed the family, and the evidence suggested it may have been one of their own. Back at the cabin, a second team combed through the ruins for additional evidence. Dusty cupboards were opened, floorboards inspected, and walls examined with chemical sprays to reveal what the naked eye could not see. Under one of the faded rugs, faint stains came to light, dark, irregular blotches that had seeped into the wood. Further analysis would confirm it was blood. Near the hearth, buried under years of debris, a weapon was found, an axe. Its handle was dry and splintered, the metal had rusted, but even after a decade, faint traces of dried blood remained caught in the cracks. It was immediately logged as a possible murder weapon. The picture grew darker as interviews with surviving relatives and townsfolk were revisited. Many recalled the father as a quiet but increasingly withdrawn man in the months before the family vanished. He was said to have argued with store clerks in town, grown irritable during simple exchanges, and once left the market muttering angrily to himself. Others remembered the mother appearing tired, her eyes hollow, as though she were carrying a weight she couldn't speak about. One woman swore she had overheard the children crying during their last trip to town, though she admitted her memory might be colored by what she knew now. Neighbors came forward with stories of screams heard faintly from the woods on a hot summer night in 1996. Most had dismissed it at the time as foxes or coyotes, sounds that were not uncommon in the rural stretches of forest. But with the discovery at the cabin, those memories resurfaced, taking on a chilling new significance. It was becoming increasingly likely that the family's end had not been sudden, but prolonged and terrifying. Forensic psychologists consulted on the case suggested a disturbing theory. Isolation, they said, could do strange things to the mind. Living cut off from the world, especially with the pressures of raising children in such conditions, could push someone unstable into a breaking point. If the father had indeed been unraveling, the axe might have become the tool through which his fractured mind lashed out at those closest to him. The claw marks in the cellar wall hinted that not all victims had died instantly. Some had fought to escape. That detail unsettled even the most hardened officers, a reminder of the unimaginable fear that had filled the cabin in its final hours. But not everyone believed the theory of a murder-suicide. Some pointed to the strangeness of the bodies being hidden beneath the floorboards. If the father had killed his family and then himself, who had dragged the bodies below and arranged them in the crawlspace? Why were there no signs of his suicide among the remains? Had he buried them, then vanished into the woods to escape justice? Or had someone else been there, a stranger, perhaps, or an acquaintance with a hidden grudge? The questions piled higher than the answers, and the case remained tangled in uncertainty. The media soon caught wind of the grisly discovery. Reporters swarmed the small town, filling the diner booths and motel rooms, eager to broadcast the story of the vanished family in the woods. Cameras rolled outside the sheriff's office as he gave careful, measured statements, refusing to speculate publicly while the investigation was ongoing. For the townspeople, the sudden attention was uncomfortable. Their quiet community had become the stage for a true crime story that spread far beyond county lines. Still, inside the cabin, the truth lingered in the silence. Every artifact, every jar of preserves, every crooked family photo, every child's toy half buried in dust, became evidence of a life interrupted. Investigators carried them out piece by piece, building a timeline, crafting theories, hoping the bones and the blood and the rusted axe would eventually speak clearly enough to reveal what really happened on that long-forgotten night in 1996. The demolition crew arrived in the spring of 2007, less than a year after the remains had been pulled from the cabin. By then, the site had become infamous. Curious strangers, amateur ghost hunters, and true crime enthusiasts traveled from out of town just to glimpse the place where the off-grid family had vanished. Locals, already uneasy about the story resurfacing, grew tired of the attention. The sheriff's office eventually decided the structure could not stand any longer. It was no longer a home but a grave, a rotting reminder of violence that seemed to seep into the ground itself. The order was given, tear it down. But before the cabin was gone, townsfolk gathered on the outskirts of the forest to talk, to speculate, to let the old story breathe once more. The official explanation, that the father, slipping into mental decline, had turned on his wife and children, was accepted by some but rejected by others. Many believed the truth was murkier, that there had been more to the family's end than one man's madness. If he had killed them, why hadn't his own body been found? If he had fled, why hadn't he resurfaced in the 10 long years that followed? Rumors thrived in the absence of closure. Some whispered he had joined a commune in another state, others that he had drowned himself in the river and was simply never recovered. A darker theory persisted too, that someone else had been out there that night, someone who knew the family's isolation made them easy prey. The demolition was a somber affair. The cabin fell quickly under the weight of machinery, its walls groaning one final time before collapsing into splinters. Dust rose into the air, carrying with it the smell of damp rot and mildew. As the boards came apart, more artifacts were unearthed: rusted cans, a child's shoe, a cracked porcelain cup. Each object felt like a fragment of a story that no one had managed to piece together fully. The remains of the family, by then buried properly in the town cemetery, had been given headstones, but the sight of their deaths remained heavy, as though the ground itself carried their memory. The town tried to move on, but the story lingered like a stain. For years afterward, hunters avoided that part of the forest. Parents warned their children never to wander too far, and when teenagers dared each other to visit the empty clearing, they returned pale, claiming they had heard voices. One group swore they saw movement among the trees, the faint outline of a man carrying an axe. Another insisted they heard children's laughter, distant and fleeting, as though carried on the wind. Whether these were tricks of imagination or something more, the stories persisted, giving the site a reputation as cursed. Local historians noted how quickly tragedy becomes folklore. The family who had once lived simply, growing vegetables and raising goats, were no longer remembered for their quiet independence but for their violent, mysterious end. The father became a figure of speculation. Was he a murderer, a victim of madness, or perhaps not guilty at all? The mother and children, whose lives had been small and private, were now immortalized as whispers in the woods. The town could never quite agree on how to tell the story, only that it needed to be told. The sheriff retired not long after the case was officially closed. In his final interview, he admitted the evidence pointed strongly toward the father, but he also confessed the investigation had left him unsettled. There were loose ends, pieces that did not fit neatly into the narrative. He said he believed the full truth had died with the family, hidden forever in those claw marks and bloodstains beneath the cabin. His words only deepened the mystery, feeding those who believed the case had never been truly solved. Years later, hikers passing near the clearing sometimes claimed the air felt different there, still, heavy, as though the forest itself remembered. The wild had reclaimed the land, grass and saplings growing over the spot where the cabin once stood. Yet even with no physical trace left, people spoke of a presence, an echo of what had happened. It was not uncommon for campers nearby to report dreams of children calling for help, or of being watched by unseen eyes in the night. The tragedy of the vanished family became a cautionary tale for the region, repeated around campfires and on late-night radio shows. It was retold in true crime documentaries, its details sensationalized, but for those who lived closest, it was never just a story. It was a wound. It was the memory of a family who had chosen to live apart, only to vanish into the darkness of the woods, their fate hidden until maggots and decay forced the truth to the surface. The cabin was gone, but its shadow remained. The family's name was etched into the cemetery stones, but their story lived on in the minds of those who dared to speak it. Some mysteries, people said, never die, they linger, like ghosts in the trees, waiting for the next passerby to listen.